Ryu Taejin slammed the last file on the table and smiled. Cho Sung-hwan sat at the head of his own council table and watched every man in that room look at the floor. 15 men. Men he had fed, protected, and trusted with his life for 12 years. Men who had eaten at his table, called him brother, shaken his hand at funerals and birthdays and every moment that mattered. Not one of them would meet his eyes. Ryu spread his hands wide, easy, relaxed. It's over, Sung-hwan. Walk away. No raised voices. No dramas. Just divorce files on a table, eyes on a floor. And one man smiling like he'd rehearsed this moment in a mirror for 3 years. They didn't even let him finish his coffee. Sung-hwan drove home alone. Walked into his house. Took off his jacket, hung it on the hook by the door. Sat down on the floor of the entryway in his white shirt and didn't move for 4 hours. His son Jae-won stood in the hallway in his school uniform, lunchbox in hand, waiting to be dropped off, watching his father sit on the floor and not understanding any of it. Sung-hwan looked at his son and could not find a single word. That was 3 months ago. He had not left the house since. There was no other woman who could take care of his house, no other woman who would be accepted by his son. Not until Zora walked through those iron gates. If you are new here, grab your popcorn. Hit that subscribe now and turn on notifications. This story promises to be hot. Now let us get back to it. The nanny agency sent 20 candidates. 19 left within 48 hours. The notes on candidate 14 said simply, no. Candidate 17 left a handwritten apology. Candidate 19 ran from the penthouse the first day she began work. Mr. Oh, Sung-hwan's assistant, had not slept properly since October and was running entirely on green tea and the specific kind of desperation that comes from loving someone who has completely stopped loving themselves. On a rainy Tuesday morning, candidate 20 knocked on the door. Delphine Asante, who was also called Zora, was 24 years old, Ghanaian British, 3 months from finishing her psychology degree in Seoul on a scholarship that covered tuition and absolutely nothing else. Her landlord had given her 2 weeks. The agency listing said live-in, immediate start, high compensation. She had ignored the part about previous candidates being unavailable for comment, picked up her bag and come anyway. Mr. O opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. She smiled. I'm Delphine, sent from the agency. I prefer to be called the last one you'll ever need, but I understand if that takes time. Mr. O stared at her for a long moment. Come in. The house was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Heavy curtains, gray light, the particular silence of a space that had forgotten what laughter sounded like and stopped expecting it. Delphine followed Mr. O into the main sitting room and felt the weight of it pressing into her shoulders. Then she saw him. Cho Sung-hwan was by the window, coffee cup in hand, looking at absolutely nothing with the focused intensity of a man who had made a decision to feel as little as possible and was succeeding. He was, objectively, one of the most handsome men she had ever seen. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the kind of broad-shouldered stillness that usually came with authority. The kind of face that made the whole situation feel deeply unfair. He looked at her for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, no, stood up, walked back into his office, closed the door. Delphine turned to Mr. O. Was that the interview? Mr. O nodded, exhausted. Did I pass? He didn't call security. That's usually a yes. Delphine set her bag down. Where is the child? Jae-won's room said everything before the boy opened his mouth. He was 4, maybe 5 years old with serious eyes that were doing far too much thinking for a face that young. He showed her the room with the quiet pride of a child who had learned to need very little and was not sure whether that was normal. The shelves were almost empty. Few books, one small car on the windowsill. Everything else had been packed away in boxes stacked neatly in the corner. He had boxed his own toys months ago so that nobody would have to pick them up after him. A 4-year-old who had made himself smaller to make grief easier for the adults around him. Delphine stood in the middle of that room and felt something set hard inside her chest. What's your name? She asked. Jae-won. I'm Delphine. I'm going to be your nanny. He studied her the way children study adults they have already learned not to trust too quickly. The others didn't stay. The others aren't me. She crouched to his eye level despite how scattered his room was. I'm staying, J1. He held her gaze, measuring. Then he nodded once. Formal. That night, after he was asleep, Delphine unpacked every box in the corner, placed every toy back on the shelves, pressed 3 drawings she found folded inside a notebook flat against the wall with tape. She put color back into the room the way you put a bandage over something still bleeding. In the morning, J1 walked in and stopped. He stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned and walked to breakfast, and his shoulders were carrying slightly less weight than they had been the night before. Delphine counted that as her first victory. Sung-hwan came past the room later that morning. He stopped, looked at the shelves, the drawings on the wall, the car on the windowsill that had been moved 3 inches to the right to make room for something else. He stood in the doorway for a very long time. He said nothing, but he stood there until Mr. O came to find him. By day 3, Delphine had identified the problem with precise clinical accuracy. Cho Sung-hwan was a man who had gone completely dark. He moved through his own house like a visitor who had decided not to renew his lease. He sat in his office not working, not reading, not doing anything visible to the human eye. Just sitting like an engine that had been running on empty so long it had finally and completely stalled. He answered questions with silence. He responded to good morning with a specific blank expression of a man who had reviewed the concept of morning and found it unconvincing. Delphine tried professional distance for exactly 2 days. Then she did what any reasonable final-year psychology student would do when confronted with a living, breathing case study. She began narrating him, trying to understand him better, and why he behaves cold. She walked past his open office doorway, glanced in, and delivered her assessment in the calm, measured tone of a nature documentary. Avoidant attachment. She noted how he positions himself adjacent to areas of household activity while initiating zero social contact. Sung-hwan looked up slowly from the desk he wasn't working at. How can I help you? I wanted talking to you about your son. Confronting the behavior is part of the process. The process? What process? A silence that had weather in it. She tried explaining, but his voice rang instantly. Leave. Displacement of anger, the kind that comes from a man that was fighting a serious inner turmoil. You can take care of him, after all you would leave in a day or 2. That's fine, but can you? The coffee cup went down on the desk with the careful precision of a man regulating enormous restraint. Are you diagnosing me or what? Take it easy, boss, she said, but his face crunched and he yelled. Get out. That's the trauma response. I am sure you would heal, sir, she replied. From around the corner of the hallway, a very small sound. Delphine looked down. J1 was sitting on the floor with his homework, mouth pressed completely shut, shoulders shaking with everything he was refusing to let out. She winked at him and kept walking. Inside his office, Sung-hwan sat very still, staring at the wall, his jaw working on something he did not intend to release. His shoulders moved once, anger surging inside of him. The school called on Thursday morning. J1 had stopped completing assignments. He sat in class and looked at the wall. And 3 weeks ago, when a classmate asked about his father, J1 had answered very quietly. He's dead. Delphine stood in Sung-hwan's office doorway holding the phone. His teacher called. J1 told his whole class you were dead. The muscle in Sung-hwan's jaw moved. He said nothing. Sir. Handle it. Delphine stared at him. She counted to 3 in her head the way her professor had taught her before responding to a difficult patient. She made it to 2. Your son told 20+ children his father does not exist. He did it because a dead father is easier to explain than a father who is in the same building and completely unreachable. That is not a school problem. That is because you are being. Handle it, he yelled back. She looked at him for a long moment. I will. But you should do something about this, sir. She turned and left. Later the next day she handled it. She called the teacher, spoke warmly and carefully, arranged a quiet conversation with J1's class. She picked J1 up herself, bought ice cream and let him talk for an hour about the aerodynamics of paper airplanes, which it turned out he knew a significant amount about, making him feel the beauty of a free world. When they got home, Jae-won came through the front door and walked straight to her. Not to his father, who was standing at the top of the stairs. To her. Natural. Automatic. The way water moves. Sung-hwan stood at the top of those stairs and watched his son walk past him without looking up. He stood there for a long time after they disappeared into the kitchen. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been absolutely rigid for 3 months moved an inch, like a wall that has received a crack and doesn't know yet whether it will hold. On Sunday, Delphine made his favorite, jollof rice. Not because it was requested. Because her mother in Accra had told her that the easiest way to a man's heart was by making his favorite meal, and something had been deeply wrong in this house since long before she arrived. The smell moved through every hallway like it owned the space. Sung-hwan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6 o'clock with the expression of a man who had fully intended to eat alone in his office and had been chemically intercepted. "What is that?" "Dinner." "Sir, please sit at the dining. I eat in my office," he yelled before turning to walk away. "Jae-won is at the table. He set a place for you. He said your name when he did it." She hadn't told him to. But Jae-won, small and deliberate at the dinner table, looked at his father in the doorway and said nothing, and simply waited, and that was more powerful than anything Delphine could have arranged. Sung-hwan sat down. The three of them ate together for the first time. The silence was enormous, the kind that has its own pressure, its own temperature. 10 full minutes of it. Delphine had survived worse. She ate her rice and waited, pride surging through her chest gently. Then Jae-won, without looking up, said quietly, "Appa, thanks for the meal." Sung-hwan's face tilted, a shock that Delphine noticed. "Thank you," Jae-won said. Said Sung-hwan. 4 syllables. The most ordinary exchange in the world. Delphine looked directly at the ceiling for 8 full seconds because her eyes were doing something she refused to allow in front of this man. Sung-hwan noticed. He looked away before she looked back down. But the line of his shoulders was different than it had been at the start of the meal. Fractionally less braced. Like a man who had been waiting for something terrible and found instead that dinner was just dinner. Later, a terrible message came at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday. Delphine heard the particular silence that changes quality when someone is awake somewhere in a sleeping house. She got up and followed it. The light was on in Sung-hwan's office. He was at his desk, phone face up, not moving. She stepped inside. He didn't tell her to leave, and that alone told her everything she needed to know about how bad it was. She peeped at the screen, and was shocked that he allowed her, a way of making her know he was tired of carrying it alone. A message from Ryu Taejin. An offer. Come back, reduced position, reduced authority, no acknowledgement of what had been done, no accounting. She read it twice. Then she sat down in the chair across from him. She didn't narrate. She didn't analyze. She didn't perform anything. She looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" Not as a question. As the honest acknowledgement of something they both already knew. He didn't answer. She didn't leave. The clock moved from 2 to 2:30 to 3. Neither of them spoke. She sat with him the way you sit with someone carrying something too heavy to put down. Not trying to take it, just refusing to let them carry it in an empty room. At 3:15, when she stood to go, he said it. "I have been betrayed by my brother and my wife. That has made me to distance myself from that boy." He stopped. Few words. Shorter than a sentence. The heaviest thing she had ever heard a person say. He turned back. She looked at him. This man who had lost an empire, a brotherhood, his ability to move through the world freely, and had sat on the floor of his own house with his son watching, despite the fact he was a rich Korean mafia boss. "I understand, sir," she said. Then she went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees until they stopped shaking. She thought of what to do to make him heal, thought of ways she could fix this home. Then something happened. If you have watched this story to this point, click on the subscribe button. You do not want to miss what happens next. Ryu Taejin came to the house on a Friday afternoon. He never called ahead, which was almost worse. And he never came alone, but walked in with the smooth, settled confidence of a man who has never once in his life believed he could lose a room. Sung-hwan met him in the front sitting room. Delphine was upstairs with Jae-won, helping him with his assignment when Mr. Oh appeared at the doorway and said very quietly, "Miss Delphine, Mr. Ryu is here." She looked at Jae-won. "Hey, do not come downstairs." Jae-won looked at her face. "Is my father okay?" "He will be. I'll be back in 5 minutes." She went downstairs and stood in the hallway just outside the sitting room doorway. She should have stayed upstairs. She knew that. But she had written her entire second-year thesis on power dynamics in high-conflict interpersonal environments, and she was not, under any circumstances, leaving Sung-hwan in that room alone. Ryu was talking. Rude. Measured. The reasonableness of a man who had long ago stopped needing to raise his voice to be dangerous. "I'm not here to cause problems. You know why I am here, Sung-hwan. I always have. You filed my accounts. I protected the organization. You know what it was. You know I had no choice." Sung-hwan said nothing. "You have to sign those papers and send to me." Delphine stepped into the doorway. She understood that would mean her boss losing his entire asset. She tried bravery the second time. "He's not interested." Both men turned. Ryu's eyes moved over her with the unhurried assessment of someone doing a quick calculation, and then he smiled, the specific smile of a man who was shocked. "You hired a new hooer," he said to Sung-hwan. "Izzy," with a smirk playing on his lips. "A nanny." She answered, "That's right." Delphine looked at his face, then at her boss and understood the calculation on his eyes. "Hi. You can leave," she said politely. Ryu looked back at Sung-hwan. He lowered his voice just enough that it was meant to be private. The room was quiet and she heard every word. "How touching a black maid now speaks for you. Must be nice, Sung-hwan. Having something new to push into bed." The room went completely still. Delphine watched Sung-hwan's face. She had spent 7 weeks mapping that face. Every suppressed response, she watched it now and saw something strange. Raw fury. "Get out, and do not let me make the guards show you how that can be done." After he left, Sung smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen on his face since the day she arrived. Not warm. Not social. The smile of a man who has just discovered something strange from someone he least expected. The door closed. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. It was not the heavy gray silence of grief. It was the clean silence after something ends. "Thank you," he said. Delphine crossed the room and stepped in front of him. "I am sorry, boss." He looked at her. Type. Eyes burning. "I never intended to," she stammered. "Do you understand what you just did?" He asked. "Now you've got yourself implicated." She held his gaze steady. "I know you won't let them, Sung-hwan." Something moved across his face. Something that had been bolted shut for 3 months moved on its hinges. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had been avoiding since the first day she walked through the door, and said something that stopped her completely. "I will protect you with all my life, Delphine." He had not called her Miss Asante Cole. He had not called her the nanny. He had called her by her name, in his quiet, deliberate voice, and turned her own framework back on her like he had been holding it in his pocket since week 2, waiting for exactly the right moment. For the first time in 7 weeks, she had absolutely nothing to say. She stopped. "Thanks so much, sir." She stopped again. "Can you get back to work?" he said softly, with just the trace of something at the corner of his mouth. Then from the top of the stairs a small voice. "Is the bad man gone?" They both looked up. Jae-won was sitting on the top step in his socks, face completely neutral in the way of a child who has absolutely been listening for the past 10 minutes and considers this his business. "Yes," Sung-hwan said. "He's gone." Jae-won came down the stairs. He crossed the floor. And he pressed himself into his father's side with the quiet, desperate certainty of a child who has been waiting months to do exactly this, and has finally decided it is safe. Sung-hwan's arm came around him. Hard. Like something his body remembered before his mind gave permission. Delphine turned to the window. She spent 30 seconds looking at the garden and only the garden. An email dropped on Delphine's phone on a Thursday. Congratulations, Miss Asante Cole. Your scholarship application has been approved. Full funding. Housing provided. Program begins in 4 weeks. Delphine sat on her bed and stared at her phone for 22 minutes. London. 3 years of fighting for it. 2 winters of sleeplessness. 17 application forms filled out at midnight with shaking hands. The thing that was supposed to change everything, take her from surviving to building, turn a degree into a career and a career into a life. She wanted to throw the phone into the garden out of happiness. She didn't tell anyone, but like they say, buildings have ears. Mr. O found out and looked at her with an expression she felt in her sternum. Sunghwan found out, she never discovered how, and said nothing for 2 days. His mind reeled that she would leave. Jae-won appeared in the kitchen doorway on Saturday morning with his serious face doing something she had never seen it do before. Are you leaving us? She crouched to his level. I don't know yet, baby. The others left, I told you would do same. I'm not the others. She smiled. He considered this with the full weight of a child who had learned that what adults said and what adults did were 2 different categories. You put my drawings on the wall, he said. Thanks. Her throat closed completely. Why not tell Dad you want to be my mum? Jae-won asked, in the calm factual tone of a child. She should have redirected. She should have kept a professional boundary. Instead she said, Jae-won. Yeah. You are the most perceptive person in this entire house. That includes your father. Do not tell him I said that. He almost smiled. The closest he had come in months. Almost. Sunghwan found her in the garden that evening. She was on the back step, phone in her hand, the scholarship email still open. She had read it 41 times. Each time it said the same thing. He sat beside her. Not across from her, not at a professional distance. He sat directly beside her on the step with the deliberateness of a man who had made up his mind about something. You should go, he said pretentiously. Her chest split straight down the center. I didn't ask for that, sir. I know. I'm telling you anyway. You have been fighting for this since before you ever walked through my door. You do not leave something like that because of... He stopped, found the exact word carefully. Because of a mere job. I understand, sir. Silence. You do, he pushed. She looked at the garden. At the light going out of the trees slowly. She watched his face and thought that she had seen this man at his lowest, most broken, most unguarded point, and she still could not look at his face without her pulse doing something that was entirely her own problem. I do not want you to, he said finally. It is not, she exhaled. She turned to face him fully. Then what are you saying? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke his voice was low and even, the voice he used when something actually mattered. For 3 months I didn't want to say anything to anyone. I stopped talking because I didn't believe what I said would hold. That anything I built or chose would stay. He paused. You came into this house and you changed the whole thing. That was my job, sir. It's the best thing. Delphine. He said her name and she stopped. You place everything in my life in place. You brought my son close to me again. You made my son stop telling people I was dead. He looked at her directly. You brought peace to my home, and that was the most useful thing anyone has done for me in 3 months. She didn't speak. I don't know what you traveling or going away looks like from here. But I know what this house looked like before you. The garden was absolutely quiet. Then, from the window directly above them, a small unhurried voice said, I have a passport. I can come with you to London. They both looked up. Jae-won was leaning on the windowsill with the settled calm of a child who had decided this conversation was too important to miss and had positioned himself accordingly. Sunghwan looked up at his son. Jae-won, you can have all of what you need, my son. I'm off to bed, he said. Noted. He didn't move immediately. He looked at Delphine with the clear, steady eyes of a young boy who understood exactly what was at stake. Then he left. After he left, Sung Hyam turned to her. I love you, Delphine. Can you please be my wife? Delphine sat taciturn. Then after they kissed, she pressed her lips together until her jaw ached. Then she laughed. Real one. The kind that came from somewhere she had not reached in a very long time. It came up from somewhere low and honest and completely out of her control. And Sunghwan, sitting beside her on the back step in the last of the evening light, let out a breath that had been held for 3 months, and smiled. Not the cold, precise smile from the room with Ryu. This one was something else. Unguarded. Quiet. The smile of a man who had stopped bracing against feeling something and found that feeling something was not, after all, the end of everything. Delphine saw it. Her heart did something loud and private and entirely her own business. She looked down at her phone. At London. 4 weeks. She thought about a boy who boxed his own toys so nobody would have to clean up after him. She thought about her professor's voice in a second-year lecture she had underlined 3 times. The greatest clinical error is believing that healing others exempts you from needing it yourself. She looked at Sunghwan. He was already looking at her. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said honestly. I know. I might go. I know. Or I might, she stopped. He waited. He had learned over 7 weeks how to wait for her. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, ask me again in a week. Something moved across his face. Careful. Warm. Okay, he said. From somewhere above them, muffled by a bedroom wall but completely audible to anyone listening from a garden on a quiet evening, a small voice said, yes, she would be my mother. And that is where we leave them. On a back step in the last of the evening light, with a little boy upstairs who already knows the answer. If this story found you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to Afro-K Stories and turn on your notifications. Every week we bring you powerful stories of bold women and the men who finally learned to deserve them. We will see you in the next episode. Do not forget to tell us, what do you think would happen if she agrees to remain? And what happens if she leaves for school and ends up being tracked down by the Dark Crew Mafia?